Hi and welcome back. My name is Dennis Frechette, and today I'm going to be reposting a video I did a few years ago on making a hook knife. Now, this hook knife was a fairly large one. I used it to carve the seat on the shop stool project, which was a stool that I built based on a Windsor chair. There wasn't a lot of interest in the Windsor chair, but there was a fair amount of interest in making this hook knife. So it was a three-part series. I decided to combine it all into one video. I did a little bit of editing, got rid of a lot of the rambling that I was doing at that time. So it's a little more concise and definitely a lot easier to watch because it's all in one video. So hope you enjoy it. Today I'm going to use this leftover piece of crowbar to make a hook knife, which is a carving knife that has a curved blade, so it allows you to dig into the surface the same way you would use a carving gouge. These come in all sizes, but I want to try making a fairly large one that'll allow me to carve out chair seats, bowls, and large spoons. I forge most of my tools out of crowbars and coil springs, which is essentially the same type of steel. And when you get to the end of the crowbar, and you don't have enough to make something like a chisel, you wind up with these little bits. And I save them because they come in handy for making a cutting edge for another tool or for making small projects like this one. First thing you need to do, of course, is to straighten them out. And then here I'm cutting off the forked end of the crowbar, which I can't use for the knife. This knife is going to have a hidden tang, and that's what I'm forging out right now. The tang has a two-sided taper, so the thickness of the taper is flat, and the two sides taper into a point. I want something that locks into the handle, but I don't want to create a splitting wedge. So I just have a taper on two sides so I can orient the grain the right way so I can hammer it into the handle and it'll be a nice tight fit, but there'll be less risk of splitting the block. Even though I'm rough forging this blank and I am trying to thin it down quite a bit, the final thickness is going to be quite a bit thicker than the finished blade. This is one situation where you do not want to forge it right down to its final dimensions. At this point, I'm setting the knife aside for a minute so I can start working on the tapered poker that I'm going to be using to burn in the tapered slot that I need in the handle. So basically, I'm just forging a pot poker that matches the taper of the tang that I forged on the knife blank, and I'm going to be using that to burn in the handle rather than using the tool itself. And the main reason I'm doing that is because I want this poker to be slightly smaller than the finished tang, so that when I burn the hole in, it'll be closer to the right size. Also, this allows me to finish the blade right now. I don't have to wait till I have the handle so that I can use the actual tang to burn in the handle and then heat treat the blade. I can do everything now and basically just move on to the next process. Here I'm setting up my filing jig in the vise because I want to be able to profile the blade now before I bend it into its final shape. This process isn't too complicated. I'm going to be using an angle grinder to get 90% of the way there, and then I'll finish off the final profile and edge bevels with the file. The beveled edge of this knife is going to be on the outside radius of the knife. So what I'm grinding now is the top surface, which is going to be on the inside of the knife. The inside curve of the knife, which again is the flat face of the knife, determines how effective this knife is going to be. If you take a shortcut here and don't create a truly flat surface from one edge to the other, you are really compromising the amount of bevel that you're going to be able to put on that knife and its effectiveness. I've made a few of these in the past, and this is where I've always screwed them up. I rushed through this process and I created a cutting edge that had actually a convex curve, so that really blunts the edge. It feels sharp to the touch, but of course you're not cutting skin, hopefully, so that doesn't mean anything. You want to be able to hone a really fine, keen edge, so this shape has to be totally flat, and the bevel on the other side has to meet to it and make a nice fine edge. If you round over this edge even a little bit, it's amazing how it just totally destroys the whole knife. So at this point I've ground away all the hammer marks and scale, and I'm back down to a clean surface, and I'm starting to use the file to define that flat face that I'm talking about. Also, you can see how the file is hitting the high spots and leaving a lot of areas that aren't touched. Here I'm a little further along and I have what appears to be a flat surface. At this point I'll start filing in a different direction and I'll notice how the scratch marks are being developed on the surface. If the surface is truly flat, I'm going to get an even scratch pattern over the entire face. If not, I need to continue filing to remove the high spots. Now that I have a flat surface on the inside edge of the knife, I'm ready to start working on the other side. And once again, I'm going to use the angle grinder to get rid of the excess material. This blade is going to have a double bevel so you can follow whatever the grain is doing without having to reposition the piece. In other words, you can push the blade away from you as well as pull it towards you. And then once the grinding's done, it's back to the file and basically following the same process that I used to flatten the back. I'm going to work one bevel, get it perfectly straight, and then I'll work on the other bevel. So here's the blade about 45 minutes later. I have everything flattened out and straight, and I have the bevels established, but I've left a blunt edge. So I'm going to need to grind that when the blade is in its final shape. Now I'm ready to shape the blade. The first bend is the hardest because I need to hammer on that inside face that needs to stay perfectly flat, but I'm able to keep my hammer blows right at the top where the cutting edge really isn't going to be used anyway, so if there's any damage, it's not really a problem. Here I'm just trying to tighten up that first bend so I can get the hook to line up with the handle the way that I want. Normally I would just set this in the vise and hammer it that way, but because this is a higher carbon steel, I don't want the vise jaws to suck the heat out of the bar too quickly and create a stress point there. So I'm just working back and forth until I get the shape that I'm looking for. Today I'm going to concentrate on getting the heat treating done for this hook knife. I used an angle grinder to smooth out the surface of the tang and to thin it down slightly, and I did the same with the burn auger, so I'm ready to go. The first step in the heat treating process is to harden the blade. So I'm going to be bringing this blade up to a light orange heat, and then I'm going to quench it in oil until it's totally cooled off to room temperature. Now when you need to heat something up in a coal forge that has some delicate edges or that may be a little complicated, like the hook knife that I'm working on now, it's a mistake to put the piece into a cold fire and bring everything up to temperature at the same time. I've found that the best way to do it is to get your fire going first, and then once the fire is established, put your piece into a hot fire. So what I'm doing here is giving the fire as much air as it needs to get going, and I don't have to worry about burning anything because the piece isn't in there yet. At this point, all the coke in the center of the fire is just white hot, so I'm going to start cutting back on the air and let the fire cool down slightly. I'm going to put my steel in now. The fire is starting to cool down. It's still very hot, but that's okay. The piece that I'm putting in is cold, so it's going to take a little while for that heat to transfer to the piece. So now I can just give the fire just a little bit of air and let it cool down so that the color of the fire is going to match the color that I'm looking for to bring the steel up to for the quench. In other words, I need to bring the steel up to a light orange for the quench. So I'm just going to give the fire enough air until it cools down to a light orange, and then let that heat transfer to the blade. And then when I have the blade evenly heated, I'm just going to pull it out and dump it in the oil. So at this point, I'm basically just letting that knife blade sit amongst all those hot coals, and I don't need to give it any air because the fire is well established and it's just cooling down. And then once the heat's transferred, I'm ready to go. So here I have the hardened blade. I've cleaned off all the oil and I've sanded the surface back down to clean metal. At this point, the blade is brittle hard. If I tried to flex it too much, it would snap, and if I put a fine edge on it, it would chip when I used it. So I need to soften it slightly. And that's done by reheating the blade to a very specific temperature. So for this knife, I'm going to try an old technique that was used before they had invented handheld torches or tempering ovens. And basically I'm going to be heating up a bar, and I'm going to be pressing that bar up against the knife blade so the heat from the bar will be transferred to the knife. I've never tempered anything using this technique before, but the reason I'm trying it here is because this knife blade poses a couple of different problems. First of all, the blade is curved, so it's a little bit awkward to get to for that reason. Secondly, it's a double-edged blade, so I really need the heat to start from the center spine and then move out towards each cutting edge, and that's very hard to do unless you have a tempering oven that can be set to a very specific temperature. Using a hot bar should give me a lot of control because I'll be able to lay the bar right on the thick spine and get that part hot. And then once that part gets hot, it should let the heat gradually go out to the edges. Also, by controlling the bar temperature, I can either accelerate the heat transfer by putting a white hot bar on the piece, or slow the whole thing down by just putting a bar on it that's basically the temperature that I'm looking for. In these first few heats, I'm basically just experimenting with the process, trying to figure out how hot the bar should be and just gauging how quickly the bar is transferring heat to the metals. I've really taken my time up to this point to make sure that the heat is being built up in the blade very, very evenly, because you need to have the heat through the entire blade. You don't want the colors to just run on the surface and leave a brittle core to the knife. So once I'm starting to see a little bit of a straw color, then I can start moving a little bit faster, because I can keep track of where the heat is going by watching how the colors are progressing. Once I've applied enough heat, I start getting a very, very light straw color. Once I have that color evenly through the entire blade, I just need to apply more heat now to darken that color to a dark straw color that's just starting to turn into a brownish tinge. That'll leave a very hard cutting edge, but it'll still leave the blade flexible enough for a hand carving tool. All in all, I'm very impressed with this technique. It's not quick by any means, but it does give you a lot of control. I can really pinpoint where I'm applying the heat, and the colors are transferring very, very evenly. I don't have any hot spots where the colors are running away from you and they're hard to control. I can just pinpoint if I see a cooler area where the colors aren't transferring, I just apply more heat there, stay away from the hot areas. So I'm definitely going to be using this technique again. Today I'm going to be finishing the hook knife by fitting it to a pretty basic handle that's going to allow me to try the knife out and see whether I want to go any further with it or not. If I like it, I'll finish the handle and make it comfortable to use. If not, I'll make whatever changes I feel are necessary. I'm going to be using a hot poker to remount the shape of the tang into the handle so I get a good tight fit. It's important to have a pilot hole drilled into the handle so that the poker can remount the hole as quickly as possible. If you don't use a pilot hole, or if the pilot hole is too small, then the poker is going to need to burn away too much material, and that's going to cause the handle to heat up too much and continue to burn once you remove the poker. So the hole is going to get too large and it won't conform to the tang. So the key is to be able to drive the poker in very quickly and remove it very quickly so that the handle is cold enough to extinguish the fire as soon as the poker is removed. That'll give you a very crisp, clean hole, and it'll be the shape of the poker. And that's very important here, because I'm not going to be gluing this tang in place. I'm just going to drive it in, and it's going to be a pressure fit between the tang and the wood for the handle. So here I'm trying the blade in the handle, and I'm happy with the fit. So now it's time to see whether I can drive the blade home without splitting the handle. When I was shaping the knife blade, I ground in a shoulder at the top of the tang, and that's going to allow me to use a punch to set the tang into the handle. When I filed in this shoulder, I used a small diameter round file to make sure that I had a really good smooth transition between the tang and the knife blade. Any kind of a sharp shoulder here or a sharp line would create a stress point that could potentially break the blade. Now I'm ready to do the final sharpening and take it for a test run. As you can see, it has a really long handle, and this knife is meant to be used with both hands, but the extra long handle also gives you the option of resting the one end up against your body or a leg or something to give you a little added leverage. There's a lot of cutting edge with this knife, so anything you can do to relieve the strain of having to grip a handle very tightly in order to control the knife will really save your hands in the long run. This knife is purely an experiment. I've never used a knife like this. I've made curved bladed knives before, but nothing with a handle this long, and I'm not really sure what's the best way to hold it or if the handle even needs to be that long. So I'm going to start using it just the way you see it here, and I'll see how it evolves as I use it for different projects. I'm going to start the final shaping of this blade with some 320 grit wet dry sandpaper. I just used some spray-on adhesive to glue a small piece to a short length of electrical conduit. That's going to allow me to get on the inside of the blade as well as shape the outside of the blade. It's really important to keep this sandpaper wet. If you use it dry, it'll clog the pores very quickly and stop cutting. But if you use it wet, you'll get a tremendous amount of work out of one piece of sandpaper. Again, this is a working knife, so I'm not going to worry about putting a mirror finish on this knife blade. I just want the surfaces that need to be flat to be truly flat, and I want a nice flat bevel going right up to the cutting edge. I don't want it to be convex in any way because that will really dull the knife. And I'm going to be using the same technique here that I used for the file work. I'm going to sand in one direction for a while, and then every once in a while I'll change directions and see how the scratch patterns are showing up. So this is the hook knife with all the sanding done. I've just used 320 with this. You could move up to 600 if you want, but I find you can go straight to a hone to sharpen the cutting edge, and moving to the 600 doesn't really give any added advantage. It just helps if you want to put a mirror finish on it because it does take away a lot of the scratches, but you can get a very serviceable cutting edge by just going from 320 right to a hone. Here I'm cutting on a dry maple block, and this is by far the hardest wood that I'll be using with this knife. And despite using a pretty dense hardwood, I'm getting some good clean shavings with very little effort, so I can imagine how well this knife is going to work in green wood or a softwood like pine or spruce.